"Dad, we need your house. Not congratulations, not a question, just that dropped in the middle of Sunday dinner like it had already been decided." I set my fork down slowly and looked at my son Trevor across my mahogany dining table, the one I'd built myself from salvaged oak 15 years ago. Only then did he add, almost as an afterthought, "Patricia's pregnant. The name's Harold Martinez, by the way. I'm 65, been retired from construction work for 3 years now, and I've lived in this house for 30 years. Built most of it myself, actually. The kitchen where we sat overlooks the backyard where I'd taught Trevor to throw a baseball when he was 8. But that Sunday evening, sitting at my own table with the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows I'd installed, I felt like I was the one who didn't belong. The order of it settled something in me before I could even respond. I smiled because that's what you do first when someone tells you they're having a baby. My fingers tightened slightly around my coffee mug, the ceramic warm against my calloused palms, but my voice stayed even. "Congratulations," I said. Patricia reached for Trevor's arm, her manicured fingers gripping his sleeve, her expression careful, watching me more than celebrating. There was no rush of excitement, no details spilling over about doctor visits or due dates, no nervous laughter about baby names, just waiting. Like they were expecting me to say something specific. The silence stretched across my dining room, heavy as the humidity that clung to Phoenix in late summer. Through the sliding glass door, I could see my workshop in the garage, tools hanging neat and orderly on pegboard I'd installed when Trevor was in high school. Everything in its place, everything earned. Then Trevor leaned forward, his elbows on the table where we'd shared thousands of meals. "Our place isn't big enough," he said, glancing at Patricia before continuing. "We've been thinking we need something bigger." The way he said "we've been thinking" made it clear this conversation had already happened, just not with me. I let the silence stretch for a second longer than they expected, watching the way Patricia's eyes darted between Trevor and me, calculating. "And you think that's my problem?" I asked. The room went dead quiet. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. Trevor looked down at his plate where the pot roast I'd cooked was getting cold. Patricia inhaled sharply, then straightened slightly like she was stepping into a role she'd rehearsed. "We're just trying to plan ahead," she said, her voice smooth as glass for the baby, for stability. I didn't lean back in my chair. I stayed where I was, one hand resting on the table's worn surface, feeling the grain of wood I'd sanded and stained myself. I watched them both the way I used to, when Trevor was younger and trying to explain why he'd come home past curfew, that same careful arrangement of features that meant he was about to try selling me something. "What exactly are you asking?" I said. Another pause, not confusion, calculation. I could almost see the wheels turning behind Patricia's pale blue eyes. Trevor cleared his throat but didn't answer right away. Patricia glanced at him, then back at me like she was measuring how direct she could afford to be. That was when I understood this wasn't an announcement at all. It was a pitch they believed had already been accepted, just waiting for me to catch up to their timeline. They didn't answer my question right away. Instead, they shifted their approach like a contractor adjusting blueprints mid-project. Patricia leaned forward slightly, folding her hands on the table like we were about to discuss something reasonable, something practical. "It's just that your house has space," she said, her voice taking on that tone people use when they're explaining something obvious, more than you really use. I glanced around my dining room, taking in the built-in china cabinet where my late wife's dishes still sat, the hardwood floors I'd refinished twice, the crown molding I'd cut and installed board by board. More than I really use. As if 30 years of memories and sweat equity could be measured in square footage. Trevor kept his eyes on the table, not correcting her, not softening her words, just letting her speak for both of them. I watched that more than anything else. Not what she said, but what he didn't say. My son, who used to help me weekend projects, sitting silent while his wife appraised my home like a piece of inventory. "This place is quiet," she continued, gesturing toward the living room where afternoon light slanted through blinds I'd custom fitted. "Stable. It would make things easier for us, especially with a baby coming." "Easier," I repeated, tasting the word. From my seat, I could see into the kitchen where I'd replaced every cabinet, upgraded every fixture, fixed every problem that 30 years could throw at a house. "So this is about convenience." Trevor shifted in his chair, the wooden legs scraping against the floor. Patricia's expression tightened just slightly, then smoothed again like water over stone. "It's about family," she replied, meeting my eyes directly. "Helping each other when it matters." I nodded once, slow and deliberate. Yes, helping, not replacing responsibility. That was when Trevor finally looked up, his brown eyes meeting mine across the table where I'd helped him with homework, where we'd planned his wedding, where I'd thought we'd someday talk about grandchildren he actually had. "Dad, we're not trying to take anything from you. We just thought maybe there's a way to make things work for everyone." For everyone. The phrasing was too careful, too practiced. I could hear the space where the real sentence should have been, the words they'd discussed in private but couldn't say out loud. "That is your child," I said quietly, my voice carrying the same authority I'd used on job sites for 40 years. "Your responsibility." The words landed clean between us, settling into the space above my dining table like dust after a demolition. Trevor opened his mouth, then closed it again, his Adam's apple working as he swallowed whatever excuse he'd been preparing. Patricia leaned back slightly in her chair, the leather creaking, reassessing her approach like a salesperson who'd just hit unexpected resistance. They didn't argue. They adjusted. "You always said you'd help if we needed it," Trevor said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. I could hear echoes of the boy who'd asked me to fix his bicycle, to help with his science project, to co-sign his first car loan. I met his eyes across the table, seeing my own brown eyes reflected back at me. "I will help you build something," I answered, each word deliberate as measuring a cut. "But I won't hand it to you." Another pause followed, heavier this time. Not confusion, resistance. Patricia tapped her fingers against the table's surface, a soft drumming that stopped abruptly when she noticed me watching. The grandfather clock in my living room chimed 6:30, its familiar sound echoing through rooms where I'd raised my son alone after his mother died. They weren't asking directly for my house. They were trying to move the conversation somewhere I hadn't agreed to go, like contractors trying to change the scope of work mid-project. And the more I listened, the clearer it became that what they wanted wasn't advice or temporary help. It was ownership transfer. Permanent and immediate. I stayed where I was, keeping my voice steady as rebar. "If you're not ready to stand on your own, why have a child?" Trevor flinched like I'd struck him, his shoulders drawing up defensively. Patricia didn't react the same way. She didn't look hurt or surprised or offended. She just watched me, her expression composed like she was running calculations rather than processing an emotional blow. That difference didn't escape me. My daughter-in-law wasn't responding like a pregnant woman whose stability was being questioned. She was responding like someone whose business proposal had hit a snag. "It's not like that," Trevor said quickly, leaning forward. "We just want to be prepared. Everyone starts somewhere, right? You had help when you were young." I almost laughed at that help. "I lived in a one-bedroom apartment for 3 years while I saved for a down payment," I said, remembering the cramped space above Murphy's Hardware where the radiator clanged all night and the neighbors played music until dawn. "Your mother and I ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner because we were putting every extra dollar toward this house." Trevor's jaw tightened. That was different. Things were cheaper then. The principal wasn't. I gestured toward the kitchen where I'd installed every appliance myself, learning plumbing and electrical work from library books because we couldn't afford contractors. "You work, you save, you sacrifice, you earn what you get." Patricia's fingers had returned to their drumming, faster now, more insistent. "That takes time," she said, and there was something sharp underneath her reasonable tone, like wire beneath insulation. "Yes," I answered simply, "it does." The sun had shifted during our conversation, casting longer shadows across the dining room floor. Through the sliding door, I could see my backyard garden, rows of tomatoes and peppers I'd planted in soil I'd amended for 30 years. Everything in its season, everything earned through patience and work. Trevor looked at me for a long moment, then asked quietly, "How did you really do it? I mean, specifically, what was your plan?" There was no challenge in his voice now, no argument. Just something that sounded like genuine uncertainty, maybe even desperation. For the first time since they'd arrived, I heard my son instead of his wife's agenda. "One step at a time," I said, and the words came easier now because they were true, not strategic. "I worked overtime every weekend for 5 years. Your mother cleaned houses after her regular job. We drove the same beat-up truck for 8 years because reliable transportation mattered more than image." I paused, remembering Saturday mornings when we'd count quarters to afford groceries, Sunday afternoons spent at free events in the park because entertainment cost money we were saving for our future. We didn't eat out. We didn't buy new clothes unless the old ones wore through. We fixed everything ourselves that we could possibly fix. I looked around my dining room, seeing it as it was then, bare subflooring, exposed studs, dreams taking shape one board at a time. We kept going even when progress felt impossible. The room settled into a different kind of silence, not resistance this time. Something heavier, because they had heard versions of this story before, just never from someone they expected to repeat it this directly. Trevor looked down again, his fingers tracing the edge of the table as if he could read the wood grain like a map, trying to calculate something he didn't want to acknowledge out loud. Patricia's gaze shifted away from me for the first time that evening, her eyes focusing somewhere past my shoulder toward the living room where framed photos showed Trevor growing up in this house, playing in this yard, building his childhood in rooms we created through sweat and sacrifice. "We just thought," Patricia began, then stopped herself. seeming to realize that whatever she'd been about to say would reveal too much about their real expectations. "You thought I'd make it easy?" I finished for her. "You thought family meant never having to prove you could handle responsibility." Neither of them contradicted me. Trevor shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Patricia's composed mask slipped just enough for me to see the frustration beneath. They'd planned for resistance, but they'd expected it to be emotional, guilt-based, something they could work around with the right combination of family obligation and pregnancy sympathy. They hadn't planned for logic. They hadn't prepared for someone who would ask them to solve their own problems. So what happens now? Trevor asked, his voice smaller than it had been all evening. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting after sitting too long, and began clearing the dinner plates they'd barely touched. "Now you figure out what you're willing to work for," I said, carrying their untouched food toward the kitchen, "and I'll know whether my son learned anything from the man who raised him." They left about 20 minutes later. Normal goodbyes, but shorter than usual. No lingering at my front door under the porch light I'd wired myself. No plans made for next Sunday. Trevor's pickup truck pulled out of my driveway with its headlights cutting through the desert dusk, and I stood at my living room window watching the taillights disappear around the corner onto Cactus Road. The next few weeks felt different, off balance like a foundation that had shifted slightly overnight. Trevor's usual Tuesday phone calls turned into short text messages. "Busy with work, talk soon." The messages turned into almost nothing. When I called and asked how things were going, he answered in broad, careful sentences that didn't say anything real. "We're figuring things out. Just busy with the pregnancy stuff. Everything's fine. Nothing about doctor appointments. Nothing about how Patricia was feeling. No morning sickness complaints, no cravings, no due date mentioned, no discussion of baby names or nursery plans. Not even small details that expectant parents usually share without thinking. The kind of updates I remembered getting from coworkers whose wives were expecting. At first, I told myself they were just adjusting to my reaction. Maybe I had made the conversation harder than it needed to be. But the absence didn't feel like distance. It felt like omission, like someone covering tracks they didn't want followed. 3 weeks after that dinner, I ran into Trevor outside Sanderson's Hardware on Maple Street, the same store where I'd bought materials for half the projects in my house. He was coming out of the plumbing section carrying a toilet repair kit, and he looked surprised to see me, like he hadn't expected our paths to cross without warning. We stood there for a moment in the late afternoon heat, both of us adjusting to the unexpected encounter. The parking lot smelled like hot asphalt and creosote, familiar desert scents that usually felt like home. "How are you?" I asked, noting the shadows under his eyes, the way his work shirt hung looser than usual. "Good," he said quickly, shifting the repair kit from one hand to the other. "Just fixing the toilet in our apartment. Landlord's slow about maintenance." I nodded, then asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind like a splinter. "How far along is she?" He hesitated. Not long, but long enough for me to notice the calculation behind his eyes. His gaze shifted briefly toward the store entrance, then came back to me. "Early," he said. "Still really early. We're not telling many people yet." The word landed flat in the space between us. No number, no estimate, no instinct to share more details. Just early, delivered like someone reading from a script they'd practiced but didn't quite believe. I didn't press him. We exchanged a few more sentences about the heat, about work, about nothing that mattered. Then he got in his truck and drove away, leaving me standing in the hardware store parking lot with questions that felt heavier than the Arizona sun. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the same table where we'd had that dinner 3 weeks ago. I replayed everything. The timing of their announcement, the way Patricia had watched me instead of sharing anything personal, the way Trevor had followed her lead instead of speaking from his heart, even the order of their words. "We need your house. Patricia's pregnant." It hadn't felt like excitement. It had felt like positioning, carefully calculated and measured. The more I turned it over in my mind, the less it seemed like news about their expanding family, and the more it felt like leverage they thought they could use, which left me with suspicions I couldn't ignore and questions I needed answers to. I decided I needed to see the truth for myself, not through phone calls or chance encounters, but directly. The next Thursday afternoon, I drove to their apartment complex on Desert Ridge, a collection of beige buildings that all looked the same, surrounded by gravel yards and struggling palm trees. I'd helped them move there 2 years ago, carrying boxes up 2 flights of outdoor stairs in 115-degree heat. I parked in the visitor section and walked up those same stairs, my boots echoing on the concrete steps. The afternoon was quiet, except for the constant hum of air conditioning units working overtime against the desert heat. Trevor opened the door after a few seconds, his expression shifting the moment he saw me. Surprise first, like someone caught off guard. Then something tighter, more guarded. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "Is Patricia home?" I asked. noting that he didn't invite me in immediately like he used to. "No," he said, stepping back but not opening the door wider. "She's at work." I stepped inside without waiting for a formal invitation the way I had hundreds of times before, but this time felt different. The apartment looked the same, but not in the way it should have. Too many things placed for appearance like a showroom rather than a home where people actually lived. There was a new 65-inch TV mounted on the living room wall, bigger than the space really accommodated. Designer handbags sat on the kitchen counter, 3 of them lined up like they were on display. The coffee table held magazines spread at precise angles, and fresh flowers sat in a vase that looked expensive. None of it matched what I knew about their financial situation. Trevor worked freelance IT support, picking up jobs when he could find them. Patricia worked part-time at a real estate office, filing papers and answering phones. Together, they might bring in $300, $500 a month on a good month. But I was looking at easily $8,000 worth of new purchases, just in what I could see from the doorway. I didn't sit down, neither did he. Instead, I turned to face him directly, the way I used to when he was 16 and I could smell beer on his breath, but he was insisting he'd only had soda. "Trevor," I said, my voice carrying the same tone I'd used to get straight answers about broken windows and dented car fenders. "Is there really a baby?" The question didn't echo in the small apartment. It didn't need to. Trevor froze like someone who just heard a smoke detector, not confused or offended, just completely still. The air conditioning cycled on, filling the silence with its mechanical hum. The silence stretched between us, heavy as concrete setting in the desert heat. And in that space, watching my son's face, I already knew the answer. Then he exhaled slowly, a sound like air leaving a punctured tire. "No." It wasn't said like a confession. It sounded like something giving way, like a dam that had been holding back pressure it was never designed to handle. I watched his face, waiting for him to look at me. He didn't. His eyes stayed fixed on the expensive coffee table, on the magazines arranged just so, on anything except meeting his father's gaze. "We thought," he started, then stopped, his voice catching slightly before continuing. "We thought it would make things easier." "Easier to do what?" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple working, "To convince you to let us have the house." The words settled without resistance. No denial, no attempt to reshape them into something more palatable. Just the truth, laid out too late to matter the way they'd hoped it would. Suddenly, everything aligned like pieces of a blueprint, finally making sense. The timing of that dinner, the way Patricia had spoken for both of them, the way Trevor had stayed quiet, letting her take the lead, the absence of pregnancy details, the lack of joy or excitement. It had never been about preparing for a child they were expecting. It had been about gaining access to assets they wanted. I felt something shift inside me, not sharp or explosive, just clear as morning light cutting through desert air. "So you lied about having a grandchild," I said quietly, "to try to get my house." He didn't argue, didn't justify it, didn't even try to soften the edges. He just stood there in his living room, surrounded by things he couldn't afford. Eyes fixed somewhere past me, as if looking directly at the truth made it heavier than he could carry. "How bad is it?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew. Trevor stayed quiet for a moment, then reached for the back of his couch, like he needed something solid to hold on to. The leather was new, still had that showroom smell, probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "It's not that bad," he said, but the words came out weak, unconvincing even to himself. I waited. Sometimes silence gets better answers than questions. He exhaled slowly, the last of his resistance crumbling. "The rent's behind 2 months, he admitted. "And the credit cards are pretty much maxed out." I didn't react to that, just kept watching him. "How many cards?" He hesitated like he was counting in his head. 4, maybe 5. I nodded once. "And the rest of it?" He rubbed his face with both hands before answering the gesture of a man who'd been carrying weight he couldn't handle. "We bought all this stuff," he said, gesturing around the apartment at the TV, the furniture, the designer bags. "We wanted the place to look right, and the car payments are killing us." Killing you meant they were drowning. The pattern was clear now, spread out before me like blueprints for a structure that had never been properly engineered. Not one bad decision, but a series of them. Each one building on the last, creating a foundation that couldn't possibly hold. "I don't understand," he said suddenly, looking up at me for the first time since I'd asked about the baby. "Everyone else we know is doing the same thing. Bigger apartments, nicer cars, all the stuff that makes you look successful. It's just how people live now. Looking successful isn't the same as being successful." "We were just trying to keep up with what?" I asked. "With people who are probably making the same mistakes you are." He didn't answer right away, then quietly. "With what everyone expects, with the way things are supposed to look." I let those words settle before I spoke again. "You're not struggling because life is unfair, Trevor. You're struggling because you're trying to live a life you haven't earned yet." His expression tightened like I'd accused him of something. That's not fair, Dad. It's accurate. He held my gaze for a few seconds longer, then looked away because he knew this wasn't about bad luck or economic circumstances or unfair expectations. They hadn't been building anything real. They had been covering gap after gap, payment after payment, hoping somehow the math would work itself out without ever addressing the fundamental problem underneath. 3 weeks later, I saw the eviction notice taped to their apartment door. I didn't call, I didn't ask that evening. A text message came through. We're moving in with Patricia's mom for a while, nothing more. No explanation, no attempt to frame it as anything other than what it was. That's when the real pressure started. I didn't see it firsthand, but I heard enough from Trevor in the spaces between his words, in the way his voice got tight when he said things were fine, in what he didn't say at all. They argued about money, about what had been spent, about what should have been cut sooner. Patricia didn't want to scale back. Trevor didn't know how to keep up with expectations that had never been realistic in the first place. The gap between them grew in the same place their budget had failed. A month later, he called. Short, flat. She left. I didn't interrupt or ask for details. She went back to her mom's place permanently, he continued. Said this isn't what she signed up for. Not the debt, not having to downsize, not dealing with reality. There was no timeline for reconciliation, no plan to work things out. Just separation, clean and final. 6 months after that, Trevor came by on a Saturday afternoon. No warning, just showed up and knocked. When I opened the door, he didn't try to explain anything. I stepped aside and let him in. We sat at my kitchen table without speaking for a few minutes. He looked different, thinner, quieter, but not broken. More like someone who'd finally stopped carrying weight that had never been his to carry in the first place. I found a studio apartment across town, he said eventually. Nothing fancy, but I can afford it. I nodded. I'm paying down the debt piece by piece. Got a steady job doing IT support for a medical practice. It's not glamorous, but it's reliable. Good. We sat there a while longer, not saying much. Before he left, he looked at me across the table where I'd raised him, where I'd taught him about responsibility and work and earning what you get. I should have listened, he said. You're listening now. After he left, I walked through my house slowly, room by room. Nothing had changed, and everything had. There was no sense of being watched anymore. No pressure sitting behind ordinary moments. No one calculating the value of what I'd built. This house had never been a solution to someone else's problems. It had never been something to fix another person's choices. It was the result of years of work, decisions made carefully, progress built without shortcuts. And now it stood exactly as it should, protected, preserved, and earned. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is letting them face the consequences of their choices, because that's the only way they learn to make better ones. A house built with your own hands isn't just shelter, it's proof that good things come to those who earn them, and that legacy is something you protect, not something you give away.